Tackling rivers late season, as in January through to March, can often be challenging. Therefore, I like to bring a selection of different feeders with me. So we've got block end feeders where I can fish maggots, casters and hemp, or a ground bait feeder where I can be selecting those particles, putting them through the ground bait feeder, plugging them with ground bait, offering different presentations and different ways of feeding your peg. The block end feeder I'll be using with generally maggots, sometimes hemp and caster, but purely particle based. The open-ended feeder I'll be packing with ground bait. I'll also put some particles through and cap the feeder off with ground bait, which allows a different presentation. Not only do I carry two different sorts of feeder, I also have to carry those feeders in different weights. Some pegs are going to be deep and slow, maybe you don't need as much weight to the feeder, and other pegs are going to be shallower and faster where you might need a lot more weight. Therefore, carrying different leads and different sized feeders allows you to target each swim as it needs it. So this all might sound quite complicated. We've got different feeders in different weights and sizes, but it's actually quite straightforward. When I'm targeting rivers at this time of year, I'll set up two rods, two identical rods, identical reels, identical main lines. The only thing I'll be changing is one rod will have a maggot feeder, as in a block end feeder, and one end will have an open-ended ground bait feeder. Because I've got two rods with two different types of feeder on, obviously I've got two different sort of bait selections to cater for that. I've got maggots, hemp and caster all separately in tubs, which I can put through the block end feeder, but I can also pick from each of those trays, put them in the ground bait and cap that off with the open-ended feeder. So for me, as a general rule of thumb, I'll always start on the open-ended ground bait feeder. This allows me to chop and change with particles, hemp, casters, maggots, potentially worms sometimes, and I'll see what the response is. I'll know this is working because I'll be getting regular indications and bites, and I'll be able to chop and change as the day goes on to suit the peg. Now some days ground bait really doesn't work. I'm not really sure why that is, I don't think anybody knows, but that's why it pays to have two different setups. So where to fish? For me, I'll generally look for the deepest part of my peg on a river. If there's reasonable flow, that's absolutely ideal. This is because, generally speaking, most of our rivers in the UK are running quite clear now. I think the deeper water helps the fish get away from predators, they feel safe and they feel more confident to feed. Now that might not always be the case on other rivers. Some smaller rivers or even some bigger rivers, you may be fishing in pegs where you've got snags or features to cast up against, weed beds to cast over. All these things are important when selecting where to fish. The peg I've chosen today is on the day ticket stretch on the Knots Piscatorials water at Rolleston. I've got a nice crease at about 20 to 22 metres. A crease is where the main flow meets slack water and it's the deepest part of the peg. Generally, this is a great fish holding spot and a perfect place to start your session. Now, something that I've learned over the years is that it pays to start with a robust setup. Now, when I say robust, I'm talking about a 10-pound reel line, and I'll generally start on an 8-pound 023 Acolyte fluorocarbon hook length. The reason for this is often at the start of the session, you can encounter some real big fish. Now, if their session turns out to be a small fish day, as in you've generally got a peg full of roach or dace, you can of course scale down smaller hooks, lighter lines, more suitable to the species. But the last thing we want to do is start the session on lighter gear, hook that big barbel and big chub and lose it early on in the day. Now I'm someone who likes to keep things simple on the bank. So for today's session on the Trent, I've selected two 14-foot distance rods. These are in the Acolyte range. I've paired these rods with two fairly powerful 5,000 size mini pit reels. Reel line choice couldn't be simpler. I've opted for 10-pound Cam as an Animal feeder line. I use this line because it's bulletproof. I've been using it now for 2 seasons and it just hasn't let me down. Now the setup I use, again, ultra simple. I always opt for a running rig. The last thing I want to do is leave a fish tethered in the river should I get snagged up. So I have a snap swivel that slides on the line, and this butts up to a swivel stop bead which protects the knot on casting. Having a snap swivel allows me to change the feeder more quickly. And having a simple setup like this really reduces tangles. Something else I just want to touch on is lengths of hook lengths. Some days when the fish are really competing for the bait, you can fish quite a short hook length, say 30 centimetres in length. And other days, maybe when you're being more patient and fishing for those bigger and more wary fish, a longer maybe a metre, maybe 1.2 metre hook length will be better. In keeping with the robust setup, I've opted for a Acolyte Super Spade to start the session because these hooks are extremely sharp and ultra strong. Now, should the session turn out to be small fish, I'd look to change that Super Spade to something with a lighter and thinner gauge of wire, like a B560 for example. Today, we're faced with a river that's just fining down after recent floods. So feeder choice today, I've opted for a 70 gram heavyweight open-ended ground bait feeder. The reason I've opted for 70 gram purely is to hold bottom in the flow. Always remember, try and fish with the lightest feeder you can get away with. The reason for this is as the fish picks up the hook bait, it can easily dislodge the feeder, which definitely gives you a more positive indication and helps you hook more fish. Now, one piece of advice I can give you is obviously these feeders are quite heavy, 70 gram unloaded. When loaded with a wet or damp ground bait with some hemp and some casters in, that feeder could have another 30 or 40 grams of weight to it. So when we're casting these feeders, it's just a case of a nice smooth casting action and let the rod do the work. Now, something that a lot of feeder anglers do nowadays is time their bites, and I find this really useful. Most of my bites today have come between 3 and 4 minutes, and you can often work out a pattern during the day. So from a match fishing point of view, a stopwatch is a really handy tool, allowing you to be more efficient, knowing when those bites are going to come and not leaving your feeder in for too long. Now for today's session, I was actually fearing the worst this morning. We were driving through frozen puddles on the way here down to the venue, and there was a hard frost. The water temperature is still incredibly cold. The river's still carrying a little bit of extra flood water, so my target for today was just to catch a fish. Now, as the session progressed, even I was surprised. We've actually had plenty of bites today. As always, I've started the session on a ground bait feeder with that robust setup, and it's a good job I did because I caught a nice chub early on. Now, as the session progressed, it was apparent there was quite a few roach in the peg, and I actually scaled down, swapped to the maggot feeder and managed to catch some lovely roach. The best hook bait today was double red maggot. However, I did catch the big chub on 3 maggots. So the next time you're out on the bank and faced with similar conditions that I've been faced with today, for me, a simple 2-rod approach is the way to go.